plural noun and enter in a celebrity. And then I'll take all of those words and put them inside of our Mad Lib, and hopefully we end up with something that's pretty funny. So how can we actually go about building this in Python? Well, the first thing we're gonna have to do is we're gonna have to be able to get these words from the user, right? That's pretty obvious. So I think what we should do is we should create 3 variables called color, plural noun, and celebrity, and we'll store the user's inputs inside of those variables. So up here, let's create those variables. The first variable I want to create is going to be called color. So we'll say color, and I want to set this equal to the input. So I'm going to say input, and inside of here, I'm just going to give them a prompt. So I'll say enter a color, and we can basically just copy this line of code, and I'm going to paste it down below, and we'll paste one more time. So now we're going to create our plural noun variable. So I'll say plurao, plural noun. And we'll just say enter a plural noun. And actually over here I want to make a colon as well. So then finally we'll create our celebrity variable, and we'll say enter a celebrity. And so now basically we're creating 3 variables called color, plural noun, and celebrity. And inside of them we're storing the color that the user enters, the plural noun the user enters, and the celebrity the user enters. So the last thing we have to do is replace these guys with those variables. So I'm basically just going to add in the color over here, and we're gonna add in the plural noun. So I can just go like this. And finally, we'll just add in that celebrity. So now we have a pretty cool Mad Lib, and it should be functional. Everything should work. It looks like it's good to go. So let's come over here and we'll run our program, and then down here in the console, we can play our little Mad Libs game. So let's say enter a color. I'm just gonna say magenta. Enter a plural noun. Why don't we say microwaves? And enter a celebrity. Let's say Tom Hanks. So when I click enter, what should happen is we should get our Mad Libs printed out. So I'm gonna click enter, and now we have our Mad Lib. So it says roses are magenta, microwaves are blue, I love Tom Hanks. So it's a pretty good Mad Lib, and obviously, you know, the more print statements we put over here, you know, the better the Mad Lib could be, and we could store as many, you know, variables up here as we wanted. This was just a very simple Mad Lib. We only took in 3 inputs, but you know, you could see how you could take something like this and create a little Mad Libs game. So your homework for this lesson is to go off and make your own Mad Libs game, hopefully one that's a little bit funnier than mine. But that's the basics of creating a Mad Libs game in Python. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about working with lists in Python. A lot of times when you're programming in Python, you're going to be dealing with large amounts of data. And when you're dealing with large amounts of data, you want to make sure that you can manage it and organize it properly. And a list is essentially just a structure that we can use inside of Python to store lists of information. So we can take a bunch of different data values, we can put them inside a list, and it allows us to organize them and keep track of them a lot easier. So generally you would create a Python list and you would put a bunch of related values inside of that list, and then you can use it throughout your program. So I'm going to show you guys just the basics of using lists. We're going to look at some of the common use cases and really just get you up to speed with what lists are and why they're useful. So over here in my program, I'm actually going to create a list, and we create a list a lot like we create a Python, just like a normal Python variable. So the first thing we want to do when we're making a list is give it a name. So we want to give it a descriptive name, something that's going to basically describe what's inside the list. In my case, for this example, let's make a list of like friends. So we could say like, here's a list of all my friends. So I can say friends, and I'm going to set this equal to the list of values that represent my friends. And when we want to create a list, we can use these open and closed square brackets. So whenever you use these open and closed square brackets, Python basically knows, okay, they want to store a bunch of values inside of this list. So why don't we go ahead and start adding some values. So we can say like my friends are like Kevin, Karen, and let's say Jim. So here I have 3 values inside of my friends array. So when we're creating a normal variable in Python, generally we just give it one value, right? So I would create a variable, I would give it one value, maybe a string or a number or a Boolean. But when we make lists, we're able to store multiple values inside of the same like little item, inside of the same object, right? And then what I can do is I can access these individual items inside of my program. So inside of this friends list, we're basically storing all of these different values, and that can be really useful. So now that we've stored some values, let's talk about what you can put inside of a list. So you can really put any piece of information in Python. We could put things like strings, numbers, or Booleans. So if I wanted, instead of just putting strings here, I could change like one of these to a number, and I could change one of these to a Boolean, and it wouldn't matter. Python's gonna be fine with that. But let's change these back to strings just for the sake of the example. So now that we've created our list, how can we access individual elements inside of this list? It's a good question. I'm gonna go ahead and print something out to the screen. The first thing we can do is we can just print out the actual list. So I can just say print friends, and then when I run this program, if we look down here in the console, you can see it's just printing out the actual list of friends, right? But let's say that I wanted to print out a specific element inside of this list. Well, I can actually refer to elements by their index. So each one of the elements inside of this list has a particular index. And the indexes actually start at 0. So we would say that this first element in the list, Kevin, has an index of 0. We would say that this other element, Karen, has an index of 1. And this third element, Jim, would have an index of 2. So even though Jim is technically the third element inside of the list, it has an index of 2. And that's because we start indexing at index position 1. And so that's just kind of how lists work, and that's how list indexes work. So if I wanted to access a specific element inside of my friends list, I can just refer to it by its index. So over here, after we type out friends, I'm just gonna type an open and closed square bracket. And inside of this open and closed square bracket, I want to put the index of the element inside the list that I want to access. So if I wanted to access this guy right here, this element, I can just put a 0. So I can say friends 0, and now when I run my program, it's just going to print out that value. It's just going to print out Kevin. If I wanted to access this Jim value over here, I can put a 2, and that will give us that Jim value. You can see right there. So we can access elements based off of their index. We can also access elements based off of their index from the back of the list. So for example, if I said -1 inside of here, this is gonna give me access to this value right here for Jim. And you can see that's what it does. So when we use negatives, it starts indexing from the back of the list. So if I said -2, this is gonna give us Karen. And so you can use the negatives to access items at the back of the list. Just keep in mind though, and this is kind of interesting, we would say this first element here is index position 0, right? But we would say the first element at the back of the list is index position -1. So just keep that in mind. So there's actually other ways that we can access like just portions of this list. So for example, let's say I just wanted to select the last 2 elements in this list and I didn't want to select the first one. Well, in here, I can just say 1 with a colon, and this will grab the element at index position 1 and all of the elements after that. So now we should just grab Jim and Karen, or Karen and Jim in that order. I could also specify a range. So actually, let me add in a couple other elements just so that we can illustrate this better. So I'll add in 2 more names. So if I wanted to, I could select like the element at index position 1 up to the element at index position 3. So it's gonna grab this one, so that's 1, 2, and it's actually not gonna grab the third one. So it's gonna grab all the elements up to, but not including 3. So it'll grab Karen and Jim. So let's go ahead and run this, and you can see it grabs Karen and Jim. So you can either just put like 1 with a colon after it, and then it'll grab that index position and everything after it, or you can specify like a range that you want to grab from. So that's how we can access elements inside of this list, but we can also modify elements. So for example, I could come down here, let's say I want to modify this value right here, Karen. Well, all I have to do is just access that element. So I could say friends and Karen is at index position 1. And I could change this to whatever I want. So I could say friends index position 1 is equal to Mike. And now when we print out friends index position 1, that value is going to be updated. So it's just going to say Mike instead of saying Karen. So it can be really useful to modify values inside of arrays. So it can be really useful to modify values inside of Python lists. So those are kind of the basics of working with lists in Python. And actually in the next tutorial, I'm going to show you guys even more ways that we can use these lists. We're going to learn how to like add elements to a list, delete elements from a list, copy lists, and a bunch of cool stuff with these lists. But for now, this has just been sort of like the basics of working with lists. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about using functions with lists in Python. In Python, a list is one of the most important structures where we can store our information. A list basically allows you to take a bunch of different values and organize them and store them inside of their own little list structure. So down here in my program, you can see I have two lists. I have a list of lucky numbers, and this is just a bunch of different numbers. And then I have a list of friends. So this could be like a list of somebody's friends, and it's basically just a bunch of strings with names in them. So these two lists are storing a bunch of different values. And what makes lists awesome is not only could I store like this many values, I mean, I could store hundreds or thousands or millions of values. And when you're working with a lot of data and a lot of information in Python, these lists are invaluable. So because lists are so important, there's actually a bunch of different functions that we can use with lists. And those functions allow us to do things like modify the lists and get information about the lists. So in this tutorial, I just want to show you a bunch of those functions. We're going to talk about some of the most common and the most popular functions that you would use on lists to make them more powerful and make them more easy to use. So the first thing we can do is obviously just print out a list. So down here, I'm printing out this friends list. And when I run my program, you see down here, we're just printing out all the elements in the list. So it's always good to be able to print out all the elements inside of a list. But there's a lot of other functions that we can use. So one function is called the extend function. And the extend function will basically allow you to take a list and append another list onto the end of it. So I could say like friends.extend, and inside of these parentheses, I can pass in the list that I want to add on to the friends list. So I could say like lucky numbers. And now when I print out this friends list, not only is it going to have all the elements in the friends list, it's also going to have all the elements inside the lucky numbers list. You can see down here we have all of our friends, and then we also have the numbers over here. So that's a really easy way to essentially just like add two lists together. We can also just add individual elements onto a list. So I could come down here and I could say friends.append, and this will actually allow me to append another item onto the end of this list. So over here, I could just add another name. So we could say Creed, for example. And now I'm like adding another friend onto the end of this list. So when I run the program, in addition to having the original items that were in the list up here, we also have this additional item at the end. And that append function is always going to add the item onto the end of the list. But let's say that you wanted to add an item into the middle of the list, so like right here or right here. There's another list function called insert. And insert is going to take two parameters. The first parameter is going to be the index where you want to insert the item. So why don't we insert it here at index position 1? I'm just going to say 1, and then I'm going to type in the name of the element that I want to add. So we can just say like Kelly. And now at index position 1, we're going to have the value Kelly, and all of these other values are going to get pushed up. They're going to get pushed to the right one index position. So now when I run the program, you can see we have Kevin, this new element Kelly, and then all the other elements have been pushed off to the right. We can also remove elements. So for example, let's say I wanted to remove this Jim value. All I have to do is just say friends.remove, and I can just type in whatever element I want to remove. So I want to remove this Jim element. And so now when we run the program, Jim is going to be gone from the list, and we just have these 4 guys left. You can also remove all of the elements from the list. So if I just wanted to completely like reset the list and get rid of everything, I could just say friends.clear. and this is gonna give us an empty list. So it'll get rid of every single element inside the list. There's also another really cool method which is called pop, and you can just type out pop like that. And basically what pop's gonna do is it's gonna pop an item off of this list. So when I click the play button, you'll see here that we're left with Kevin, Karen, Jim, and Oscar. So we basically got rid of the last element inside the list, and that's what pop does. It pops an element off of the list. So it basically removes the last element in the list. So we have our list, but let's say that we wanted to figure out if a certain element was in this list, right? If a certain value is in here. So let's say I wanted to check to see if my friend Kevin was in this list. Well, I could say friends.index, and in here I can just pass a value. So I could say like Kevin, and this is gonna tell me the index of Kevin. So it'll tell me if Kevin's in the list. So now when I click play, you can see down here it says 0. If I was to say like Oscar in here, for example, now it'll give me the index of Oscar. So that's at 3. But if I put a name that wasn't in here, so like if I put Mike, that's not in the list. And so now we're gonna get back an error because it says Mike is not in the list. So that's an easy way to figure out if a specific element is inside of the list. And if it is, then you'll know what index it's at. You can also count the number of similar elements in the list. So I'm actually gonna come down here, copy this Jim element, and we'll add another Jim element into here. So I could come down here and I could say friends.count, and we'll pass in Jim. And this will tell me how many times the value Jim shows up inside of this list. So it should say 2, which it does down there because we have 2 values with the text Jim. And so we have all these values. We could also sort this list. So I could come over here and I could say friends.sort. And what this will do is it'll sort the list in ascending order. So we have a bunch of text here and you'll see what it does. Basically what it's gonna do is it's gonna put it in alphabetical order. So you can see we have J, K, O, and T. So the list went from being just random order, like whatever we had up here, to now it's in alphabetical order. And that's also gonna work for lucky numbers. So I could say like lucky numbers dot sort, and then we'll print out lucky numbers. And these should now be in ascending order, which I'm realizing they already are up here, but if I was to take this 42 and put it down here, now it will figure everything out and put it in ascending order anyway. We can also reverse a list. So if I wanted, I could reverse this lucky numbers list. I could say lucky numbers dot reverse, and now when we print it out, instead of being 42, 8, 15, 16, 23, it's gonna be 23, 16, 15, 8, 42. So it's basically just reverse the order of the list. And finally, there's one more list function I want to show you guys, which is copy. So I could actually create another list and I could make it as a copy. So I could say like friends2, and we could set this equal to friends.copy. And now friends2 is gonna have all the same attributes as friends, because it's basically just like copied. It basically took a copy of that friends list. So you can see it's the same exact thing. And copying lists can come in handy in a lot of different situations. So those are just some basic list functions, and just to kind of like, you know, get your feet wet in working with lists. Obviously, like the more you work with them, the more you practice using these different functions, the more comfortable you're gonna get. But that's just kind of like a basic overview of what you can do. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about tuples in Python. Now, a tuple is a type of data structure, which basically means it's a container where we can store different values. Now, if you're familiar with lists in Python, a tuple is actually very similar to a list. It's basically a structure where we can store multiple pieces of information. But a tuple has a few key differences from lists that we're going to talk about in this tutorial. First thing I want to do is I want to show you though how to create a tuple. So I can come down here and I can create a tuple, and one of the most common examples of tuples is coordinates. So let's say I had a series of like XY coordinates. I could create a variable called coordinates, and I'm just going to set this equal to an open and close parentheses. And whenever we want to create a tuple inside of Python, we're going to use these open and closed parentheses. And inside of here, inside of these parentheses, we're going to put the values that we want to store. So I could, for example, put a list of numbers. So this could be like my coordinates. I could have like 4 and 5. So this would be my tuple with coordinates inside of it. And one of the things about tuples that makes them unique is a tuple is immutable. And you'll hear that word a lot when we're talking about tuples, immutable. It basically means that the tuple can't be changed or modified. Once we create our tuple up here, you cannot modify it, you cannot change it, you can't add elements to it, you can't erase elements from it, you can't change any of the elements inside the tuple. What you see is what you get. Once you create the tuple, it's as it is, it can't change. So I could come down here and I could print out some of the attributes inside the tuple, and the way I can access them is just by using an open and closed square bracket, and in here I can pass in a index. So tuples are indexed starting at 0, so technically we would say that 4 is at index position 1, and 4 is at index position 0 and 5 is at index position 1. So if I said coordinates 0, now it should print out 4. And down here, we're printing out 4. So if I wanted to print out that 5, we can just put a 1 inside of those square brackets, and now we'll print out that 5. So I can access the elements inside of a tuple. I can easily access each entry, but if I was to come over here and try to change one of the elements, so if I said coordinates and coordinates 1, and I tried to set it equal to something else like 10, Python's actually going to give us an error when we run this program. So I'm going to run the program. You see we get this error. It says type error tuple object does not support item assignment because it's immutable, because we can't change it. So that's basically what tuples are, how we can create them. And you know, a tuple, like I said, it's very simple. You just create it and then you have it. And now I want to talk to you guys about a common topic in Python, which is the difference between tuples and lists. So remember, a list is basically doing the same thing. A list, if we wanted to create a list, we would just use square brackets instead of those parentheses. And if I was using a list, I could assign different values to it. I could basically mutate any of the elements. I could add, delete, modify, change, whatever I wanted with the list. But with a tuple, we can't do that. And that's sort of the basic difference. And really, Python doesn't say anything more than that. It basically just says like one of them's immutable, one of them's not. But in practical use cases, generally people will use tuples for data that's never going to change. So you'll store data inside of a tuple when that data doesn't need to be mutated. That's why something like coordinates is such a good candidate for a tuple, because once you have coordinates, like we're probably not going to modify them, right? We might add other coordinates. So for example, if I wanted, I could create a list of tuples. So I could say like 4, 5, 6, 7. Maybe we have some other coordinates like 80, 34. So here I have a list, and inside of it we have these tuples. But remember, these tuples can't be modified. The values can't be changed. So really, it's just a case-by-case basis. I would say by a huge majority, you're going to be using lists most of the time. Tuples are more of a niche. You know, they're used in more special situations. But there are plenty of situations where you want to use tuples. So if you're in a situation where you want to store data that can't be changed or mutated, then tuples are the way to go. So yeah, that's just some basics about tuples, some basics about the difference between lists and tuples. And so a tuple is a great thing to add into your Python repertoire. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about using functions in Python. Now, a function is basically just a collection of code which performs a specific task. So I can take a bunch of lines of code that are basically doing one thing. I can put them inside of a function, and then when I wanted to do that task or do that one thing that the function was doing, I can just call the function. And so functions really help you to organize your code a lot better. They allow you to kind of break up your code into different, little chunks that are doing different things. And they're really just awesome. So functions are like a very core concept when we're talking about programming in Python. So I'm going to show you guys how to create an awesome function today. Let's say for the purposes of this tutorial, we want to create a function that says hi to the user. So the one task that our function performs is basically just saying hi to whoever is writing the program. So over here, if I want to write a function, the first thing I have to use is a keyword in Python. It's called def, so D-E-F. And basically when Python sees this keyword, it's going to say, oh, okay, this person wants to use a function. And so after we type out def, we need to give this function a name. So just like when we are creating variables, we give them descriptive names, we also want to do the same thing with functions. So if I'm creating a function, I can just give it a specific name, which basically says like what it's doing. So we're going to create a function that says hi. So I'm just going to call this function say hi, just like that. And once we type out the name of the function, and so also I could type out say hi with no underscore, or I could type out say hi with an underscore. Both are considered like good practices in Python. A lot of times, if you just have a simple like 2-word function like this, you don't need to put an underscore, but we could put an underscore there if we wanted. After we type out the name of the function, I'm just gonna type an open and close parentheses, and then I'm gonna type a colon. And basically what this is doing is it's saying to Python like, all right, all the code that comes after this line is going to be inside of our function. And in order to write code that's going to end up being inside the function, we actually have to indent it. So over here, you'll notice that when I clicked enter, my text editor automatically indented the text. So it's automatically like using this indent here. And that's kind of like one of the rules in Python is like the code that goes inside of this function needs to be indented. So if I was to write some code like out here, this is no longer going to be considered inside the function. So you can see as I type out code, and obviously this isn't real code, but as I type text over here that's indented, this little like marker over here is basically saying like, oh yeah, that's inside the function. But then when I write code over here that is like not at the same indentation level as this stuff, it's no longer considering it inside the function. So that's just a little thing. Any code inside this function needs to be indented. All right, so our function is just gonna say hi to the user. So I'm just gonna have it print out some text. It's gonna say hello user. So this is a very simple function. Obviously we just have one line of code, and inside of a function you could have as many lines of code as you want, but for our purposes we only need one line in order to perform our function. So now all we have to do is call this function. So if I want to execute the code inside of this function, I have to do something called calling it. So if I was to just run my program as it is right now, I'm just gonna run it, you'll see that nothing happens over here, right? Even though this function is printing out hello user, when I run the program, it's not doing it. And that's because the code inside of a function isn't gonna get executed by default. The code inside of a function is only going to get executed when we specify that we want to execute it. And in order to do that, we're going to have to do something called calling the function. So in order to call the function, you basically just type out the function's name and those open and close parentheses. So I'm just going to type out say hi and open and close parentheses. And now when we run this program again, you'll see that it prints out hello user. So we're executing the code inside of the function. And I want to show you guys just one more thing here, just talking to you guys about how these functions actually work. So up here, I'm going to print top, and then down here, I'm going to print bottom. So I want to show you guys the flow of these functions inside the program. So when I run this program, you'll see we print out top, hello user, and then bottom. So essentially what's happening is when Python goes through and executes this program, it goes over here to this first line. It says, okay, we want to print out the word top. And then it goes down here and it says, okay, we want to execute the say hi function. So Python actually jumps up and it goes over to this say hi function, and it's going to execute all of the code inside of this function. So it's going to go through, execute all of this code, and then once it's done executing all of the code in the function, it's going to jump back down here and it's going to move on to the next line, which is bottom. So that's kind of like the flow of functions. Again, with functions, generally when we're naming these functions, you want them to be named in all lowercase. And usually when we're naming stuff in Python, if there's 2 or more words, we're going to use an underspace or an underscore in between them. So I could write this out as say underscore hi. But in a lot of situations though, if I have a function like this where the name is really short, it might just be easier to leave it without an underscore. But why don't we just put an underscore in there just to be super Python official. All right, so now we can actually make these functions a little bit more powerful. And what we can do is we can give them information. So a lot of times when we write a function, we're gonna want to have additional information that gets passed in. And these are called parameters. So a parameter is a piece of information that we give to the function. So over here, I can actually specify that this function needs to receive some parameters. So I can basically say like, hey, if you're gonna call this function, you need to give us some information. You need to give us some parameters. And all I have to do that is just type out the name of the parameter that I want to receive. So why don't we allow the code calling this function to tell it what name to say hi to. Up here, I can just say name. And basically what this means is, it means whenever I call this say hi function, we have to give it a name. So down here, if I was to call this, I have to include a name in here. So I can say like Mike. And what we can do now is we can actually access this parameter or this variable inside of our function. So I could come over here and instead of saying hello user, I could say hello name. And basically what this is gonna do is it's just gonna say hello to whatever name got passed in here. So I'm actually gonna copy this and we will do this twice. So I'll say hello Mike, hello Steve. And now when I run this program, you'll see that instead of just saying hello user, it's saying hello to whichever name I passed into the function. So that's why this can be really useful, right? We can give the function information, and depending on the information we give it, it'll perform its task a little bit differently. I could also include more than one parameter. So you can, I mean, technically you could have like as many parameters as you want. So I can put another one in here, we could say age, and now I'm gonna have to pass in an age along with these. So I'm just gonna pass in an age and pass in an age for down here. And I'm just gonna pass in strings. So we can say hello name, you are age. So I'm passing in 2 pieces of information. And now when we run this program, it's gonna call the function and it's gonna use both of those pieces of information. So I'll say, hello Mike, you are 35. Hello Steve, you are 70. So essentially we're writing out this one line of code which just prints out like hello to someone, and we're allowing this function to receive 2 parameters, so the name and the age. And depending on the name and the age, the function is going to print out hello a little bit differently. And that's kind of the beauty of using functions. So you could pass anything you want into a function. So for example, I could pass in a integer instead of a string for the age. So like I could pass in a number. The only difference is over here, we're going to have to convert this into a string, but it's going to work just the same. So you could pass in strings, numbers, booleans, arrays. You can really pass any type of data into a function and it's gonna work. So you can see here we get the same result. So that's the basics of functions, and as you go through with Python, you're gonna be using functions more and more. And generally, it's a good idea to break your code up into different functions. So whenever you have like a grouping of code that's designed to perform a specific task, that's usually a good candidate to be put inside of a function. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about using the return statement in Python functions. Now, a Python function is basically just a collection of Python code that performs a specific task. And when we want to perform that task in our Python programs, we can call a Python function. And a lot of times when we're calling a Python function, we just kind of call it and it does its thing and then we move on with the program. But sometimes when we call a function, we're actually gonna want to get information back from that function. So when I call the function, I want it to basically execute its task. I want it to execute all the code. And then I want it to like give me some information back. So that could be like a particular value. It could be something like telling me how the task went. Basically, the function can just communicate back to us like, hey, here's some information. And that's what the return keyword can allow us to do. The return keyword can basically allow Python to return information from a function. So I'm going to show you guys how we can do this. I want to create a very simple function, and it's just going to cube a number. So when we cube a number, we take it to the power of 3. So if I was going to cube like 2, it'd be like 2 raised to the power of 3. Right? It's just pretty basic math. So we're going to make a function that will cube a number, and I'll show you guys how we can use that return statement. So first thing we want to do is make a function. I'm just going to say def cube. We'll call the function cube. And over here we can specify any parameters that this function will take. So basically any values that we want to give this function. So we're going to give it one function, which is just going to be a number. So I'm just going to call it num. And then over here I'm going to type out a colon. And then down here, we can put any of the code that we want to be included in this function. So basically this function is just gonna cube this number. So we could just type out num times num times num, right? That's gonna give us num cubed. So that's all well and good. And if I come down here, I can execute this function. So I can basically just call it, I'll say cube, and why don't we pass it a 3? So I'm gonna go ahead and pass it a 3. And I'm going to save this. And now let's go ahead and run this code. So we'll run the code, and you'll see down here, nothing happened, right? So nothing got printed out in our program. In fact, when we called this cube function, it didn't really do anything. So let me try to print this out. So maybe if we print this function out, it'll give us back the information that we want. So type out print, and we'll print out the value of the function. I'm just going to click play. If you look down here, it says none. So when I printed out the value of this function, it told me none. But really, this function is supposed to be cubing the number. And here's how we can use the return statement in Python. I can come over here and I can just say return. And now Python is going to return whatever value we put over here to the right. So when I call this cube function and I give it a 3, Python's going to go off, it's going to execute this function. When it sees this return statement, it's going to say, okay, I want to give a value back to whatever called this function, and it's going to return this value. Now, when I print out cube 3, it should print out the answer because we get an answer back. So when I play this, you'll see down here, says 27, so we got the correct answer. So I could do this with anything. Why don't we cube like 4 or something? So now I'll run this, and you can see we're constantly getting the correct answer back. So that's the basics of using this return statement. It allows us to return a value back to the caller. In other words, back to whatever's calling the function. So I just want to illustrate this point a little bit further. I'm going to come up here. I'm actually going to create a variable. So I'm going to create a variable called result, and I'm just going to set it equal to cube 4. This variable result is going to store the value that gets returned from the cube function. So it's not going to store like cube 4. It's going to store the value that gets returned from executing that function. So now if I came down here and printed out result, it's actually just going to print out 64 again because that's the value that it's storing. So this return statement can be really useful for like getting information back from a function. We can use something like a parameter, like this 4 is a parameter, and we can give information to a function, and then we can use the return statement to get information back from a function. And I do just want to point out one more thing. I'm actually not able to put any code after this return statement. So if I came down here and tried to put like a print statement, this actually isn't going to work. So this is never going to get printed out. So if I just typed out like code right here, when we run this program, it's not going to type out code. That's because when I use this return keyword, it breaks us out of the function. So Python's going to go through, it's going to execute the code in the function. Whenever it sees this return keyword, it's just going to break back out and we're going to be done. So we'll never be able to reach this line of code. So that's the basics of using return statements, and you can return any data type you want. We could easily return like a string or a Boolean or an array. It doesn't really matter. You can return whatever you want. And a lot of times, in a lot of situations, you're going to want to get a value back from a function. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about using if statements in Python. Now, if statements are a special structure in Python where we can actually help our programs to make decisions. So by using an if statement, I could execute certain code when certain conditions are true, and I could execute other code when other conditions are true. So basically, if statements allow our programs to respond to the input that they're given. So depending on the data that we're using in the program, our programs will be able to respond. So when certain data is certain values, we can do certain things. And when other data is other values, we can do other things. So your programs are essentially becoming a lot smarter. And actually, if statements are things that we as human beings deal with every day. So, as you go throughout your day, generally you're dealing with if statements all the time. So I want to kind of give you guys a brief introduction into if statements, and we'll talk about some of the common if statements that you'd see in everyday life. And then we'll go ahead and do a really awesome example to kind of like show you guys what if statements can do for us. So over here in my text editor, I just have this little text file, and in here I wrote out a bunch of if statements that a lot of people will encounter on a daily basis. So here's the first one. It says, I wake up, if I'm hungry, I eat breakfast. And so let's break this down a little bit. Up here it says, if I'm hungry, and this is a condition, right? This is either going to be true or it's going to be false, right? If it's true, I'm going to go ahead and eat breakfast, right? If it's false, I'm just going to skip whatever was in here and move on, right? So that's the basics of an if statement, right? We have a condition, in this case, if I'm hungry. If the condition's true, then we do the action, so we eat breakfast. Otherwise, we just skip it. So down here we have another one. It says, I leave my house. If it's cloudy, I bring an umbrella. Otherwise, I bring sunglasses. And so this one is a little bit more complex than the one we just looked at. You'll see we have our condition, right? It says if it's cloudy. If that condition's true, we're going to bring the umbrella. But in this case, if the condition's false, there's something else that we want to do. So in the case up here, if this condition was false, we just moved on. But now, if this condition's false, then we're going to go ahead and bring sunglasses. So that's another example of an if statement. It's a little bit more complex. Finally, I have one more down here, and this one's even more complex. It says, I'm at a restaurant. If I want meat, I order a steak. So if this condition's true, we order the steak. But if this condition is false, then we're going to move on, and we're actually going to check another condition. So I'm going to say, otherwise, if I want pasta, I order spaghetti and meatballs. This is another condition. If this condition's true, we get the spaghetti. If it's not true, then finally we're going to move on down here and we'll just default to ordering the salad. So all three of these if statements are valid if statements. It's just they get more and more complex as we go down the list. So hopefully that's, you can kind of wrap your head around what if statements are. We're basically specifying conditions. If those conditions are true, we're going to do certain things. And if those conditions are false, we can do other things, or we can check other conditions. All right, so let's head over to our Python file and we'll start writing some actual Python. So in here in my app.python file, I want to create an if statement. And I'm going to show you guys a very basic if statement in this tutorial. And then in the next tutorial, we're going to look at some more advanced if statements. And so what I want to do is create a Boolean variable. So I'm going to create a Boolean variable that's going to store whether or not the user is a male. So it's just going to be called is_male. And I'm going to set this equal to true because I'm a male. So we have this Boolean variable, right? And right now we have it set equal to true. I can actually use an if statement to check to see what the value of this variable is. And if it's true, I can do something. So if I want to use an if statement, all I have to do is just type out if, and then I just need to type out a condition. So basically I would have to type out like something that's going to be true or false. Like for example, in the other page we were specifying like if I'm hungry or if it's cloudy. Here we're just going to check to see if is male. So in other words, if the person is male. And so remember, this has to be it has to be able to be reducible to a true or a false value. So in our case, we're just using a Boolean because that's like the easiest thing we can do. So I said if, I specified my true or false condition. Now I want to just type a colon. And what I want to do now is make a new line. And so anything that I put below this with an indentation is actually going to be executed when that condition's true. So I could put print, and down here I could just put you are a male. And now you'll see what happens when I run this program. It's going to go down here and it's going to say you are a male. But if I changed is male to false, so instead of this being true, I just change it to false, now all of a sudden it's not going to print anything. So it's just going to be blank down here. That's because this condition wasn't true. So anything that I put below this if declaration and that has an indentation like that is going to be executed when the if statement is true. We can also use another keyword in Python, which is called else. And else is basically going to be like otherwise. So you remember before we said, if it's cloudy, I'll bring an umbrella. Otherwise, I'll bring sunglasses. Well, this is going to be like our otherwise. So I can say down here, else. And now anything that I put below else is going to get printed out when that condition isn't true. So why don't we just put, you are not a male. So now we're able to cover both of the situations for this variable. If it's false, we can cover that situation. So it says you are not a male. If it's true, we can cover that situation as well. So it'll say you are a male. So that's pretty cool. But we can also make these more complex. And actually, before I talk about that, you can put as much code as you want inside of an if statement. So I could have like, dozens of lines of code if I wanted. I'm just giving you guys a very simple example. So why don't we make this more complex, and I'm gonna add another variable into the mix. So I'm gonna add another, Boolean attribute into this mix. I'm gonna make another variable called is tall, and we're gonna set this equal to true as well. So now I have two variables in the mix. Let's say I wanted to write an if statement that will check both of those variables. So I could write an if statement that's like, if they're male and they're tall, or if they're male and they're not tall, or if they're not male and they're tall. Like I could write out a bunch of if statements to check the combination of these variables. And so the way I can do that is by using one of two keywords. So the first keyword I want to show you guys is the or keyword. So I can come over here and I can say if is male or is underscore tall. And what this is basically going to do is it's going to say if the person is either male or if they're tall, then we want to do something. So this is only going to be true when one of these values is true, when one or both of those values is true. So down here we could actually put, instead of you are a male, we could put you are a male or tall or both. That's going to be more appropriate. And then down here we would say you are neither male nor tall. And that's because if we execute the code inside of this else, that means that both of these guys are false, right? So I'm saying if they're male or they're tall, we're going to execute whatever is in here. Otherwise, that means they're neither male nor tall. We're just going to execute this down here. So let me show you guys how this works. I'll click play, and these are both true. So it's going to say you are a male or tall or both. If I was to set one of these to false, so let's set is male equal to false. Now, it's still going to say you are a male or tall or both. But if I set them both equal to false, now it's going to say you're neither male nor tall. So that's kind of the basics of using the or operator. And there's another operator we can use which is called and. And basically it's similar to or, except both of these conditions have to be true. So this is basically saying if the person is male and they're also tall, then we're going to execute whatever's in here. So we could actually change this text to say you are a tall male, because we know for a fact that if this is getting executed, they're both male and tall. We can also change this print statement down here. This could say you are either not male or not tall or both. So you can see it's basically just saying that you're either not one of them or you're not both of them. So we click the play button and you'll see because they're both false, it's gonna say you are either not male or not tall or both. But if I make them both true, now it's gonna say you are a tall male. If I was gonna make one of these false though, so let's make is tall false, now it's not gonna execute this first print statement, it's gonna execute the one inside of the else. So it'll say you are either not male or not tall or both. So that's the basics of and or, and you'll be using those a lot as you use your if statements. But there's actually one more thing we can do. We can add in some more conditions. So up here I'm checking if they're male and they're tall, but what if I wanted to check if they're male and they're not tall? So if they're like a short male. I can use another keyword in Python called elseif, or really it's just typed out ELIF. And it stands for else if. And after this, we can put another condition. So over here, I'm gonna check to see if they're male and they're not tall. So I'm gonna say else if male is male, and now I can type in not tall. And the way I can do that is by saying not, and open and close parentheses, and saying is tall. And basically when I use this not function, it's going to negate whatever is inside of here. So if this was true, it's gonna make it false. And if this was false, it's gonna make it true. So basically that'll tell us whether or not they're tall. And then I'm gonna use a colon, and now down here, inside of here, we're basically just gonna type out any of the code that we want to happen when this condition's true. So down here, we can just print out, you are a short male. And there's actually one more condition that we want to check for, which would be if they're not male and they're tall. So we can make one more else if, and I'm actually just going to copy this guy and we'll paste it down here. And so I want to say if not is male and is tall. So now we're checking to see if they're male and, or if they're not male and they're tall. So here we could say you are not a male but are tall. So essentially here we have an if statement that's going to cover every single condition for these two variables. So in every single situation of the two values of these variables, we're going to be able to print something out for it. So if I made both of these true, it's basically going to tell us you are a tall male. If I make is male false, it's going to tell us you are not a male but are tall. If I made is male true and is tall false, then it's going to tell us you are a short male. And if I made both of these false, it's going to tell us you are either not male or not tall or both. And actually we need to change this. So this should say you are not a male and not tall. So that would be a better printout for that situation. So you can basically see how we can use ifs, else ifs, and else in order to help our program to make decisions and really to respond to the different data in our programs. So I'm able to respond to every combination of the values for these two variables, and that's really cool. So in this example, we were just using simple Boolean variables, but in the next tutorial, I'm going to show you guys how you can actually use something called comparison operators. So we could compare like two numbers or two strings, and we could use those as our conditions. But for now, I think this is a good introduction into if statements. So I'll see you guys in the next tutorial. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you some more about if statements in Python. More specifically, we're going to be looking at using comparisons inside of our if statements. So if you're following along with the course, in the last tutorial, I talked to you guys about just the basics of if statements, and we used a couple different Boolean variables. And depending on the values of those Booleans, we were able to do certain things. In this tutorial, we're going to look at another way to use if statements, which is with comparisons. So instead of just using Boolean values, we can actually compare different values. So like I could compare a couple numbers, or I could compare a couple strings, and depending on the results of those comparisons, we can do certain things. So this is going to be pretty cool, and this is really going to give you guys a full understanding of what you can do with if statements. So for this tutorial, I actually want to create a Python function, and this function is going to give us the maximum number that we pass into it. So this function is going to take 3 parameters as input, and it's going to print out the biggest number that we give it. So let's create this function. I'm just going to say def, and I'm just going to call it max num, and inside of these parentheses, I'm going to specify that I want 3 parameters as input. So I'm going to say num1, num2, and num3. So basically, we're passing it 3 numbers, and this function will return the largest of the 3. So in order to figure out which of these numbers is the largest, we're going to have to use an if statement. So I can say if, and over here, I need to specify a condition, right? So I need to put like a true or a false value. And so what we can actually do is we can compare these different numbers. So I could say if num1 is greater than or equal to num2, and num1 is greater than or equal to num3. So basically what I'm doing here is I'm comparing these different numbers. So I'm saying if the first number is greater than or equal to the second number. And this is a comparison. So when you think about it, when we compare these 2 numbers, we're going to end up with a true or a false value, right? Num1 is either greater than or equal to num2, or it's not. It's actually a Boolean value, right? It's either true or it's false. Same thing over here. The result of this comparison is either true or it's false. So technically, I'm putting a true or false value in there. I'm just getting that true or false value by using a comparison. And you'll notice over here, we're using something called a comparison operator. And basically, this is just like how we want to compare them. So we're saying like greater than or equal to in this case. So down here, if this whole condition is true, in other words, if the results of these 2 comparisons end up being true, then we know that num1 is the biggest, so I can just return num1. I can say return num1. But we also want to check some other conditions, so I can say elif, and now I want to do some other comparisons. So I'm going to say else if num2 is greater than or equal to num1, and num2 is greater than or equal to num3. So I'm doing essentially what I did up here, except for num2. So again, I'm comparing these different numbers, and this is going to end up being a true or a false value depending on the result of the comparison. So down here again, we can just return num2, because if all of this is true, that means we're going to end up returning num2. And then finally, we can just say else. So if num1 isn't the biggest and num2 isn't the biggest, then we can pretty much assume that num3 is the biggest. So now we have our function. So down here, I'm actually just going to call this function. So I'm just going to say, actually, I'll print out the result. So I'll say max num, and we'll pass in like 3, 4, 5. So we're basically calling that new function that we just made. And I'm going to go ahead and run this program. So you can see down here in the output, we printed out 5 because that was the biggest. If I was to change this middle one to the biggest, so we make the middle one 40, now it'll be able to take on that situation. And finally, I can make this like 300, and it'll be able to handle that. So no matter which number, num1, num2, or num3 ends up being the biggest, it's able to tell us without a problem. So these comparisons are a really, really, really common way to make if statements. And a lot of times, you're going to want to be comparing different values inside of Python. So over here, we're comparing numbers, but we could also compare strings. So I could easily make these both like you know, I could make this like dog, and I can make this dog, and I could say a different operator. So I could say like this double equal sign would mean equal. So I could basically say like if this string is equal to that string. So you can basically like compare all different data types. You know, I could compare numbers, strings. You could also compare Booleans. So once again, these are comparison operators, and this one is greater than or equal to, but there's a bunch of other comparison operators we can use. So the most basic is just going to be a double equal sign, and that basically checks to see if the two values are equal. So it'll say like if number 1 is equal